at work with another Wolff Responds. I want to respond to many of you asking me basically the following question. How is it possible that the stock market is going up while we are experiencing the worst decline in our economy, the worst levels of unemployment in a century, going back to the Great Depression of the 1930s? Perfectly good question. Here's the answer. The connection between the stock market and what goes on in the rest of the real world that we live in, outside of the markets in New York City and so on, the disconnection there is long-standing. These are two different worlds. There's not zero connection. Obviously, they have something to do with one another. If stocks are booming and going up, the people who own them feel more comfortable about spending money, and that shows up in goods and services produced and sold, and vice versa when the stock market is going down. And likewise, if things are booming on Main Street, it has its impacts on Wall Street. Having said that, though, the disconnection is more pronounced now than ever. And the reason for that, there are two basic ones. Number one, the vast majority of Americans have no significant interest in the stock market. They either own no shares, or they own a quantity of shares in a pension fund managed by a big company, a big bank, and so forth. Or maybe they have a few shares, but not enough to make a difference. Most corporations are perfectly well run by what are called major shareholders, the big owners of big blocks of shares. Those are the pension funds, the big banks, wealthy individuals, and all of that. In other words, the majority of people don't have much to do in any direct way with the stock market. And the people who do have to do with the stock market, brokerage houses, insurance companies, big banks, wealthy corporations, wealthy individuals, those are the people most affected by the other part of the explanation. They're the ones that get into their hands government money on an ongoing basis now for a long time, but particularly when the economy begins to tank. It's done that 3 times so far in the young century we're living in. The dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the coronavirus crisis in 2020. Each time these crises have prompted the government of the United States and many other countries to pump money into the system. That's how these crises are, quote unquote, managed. And how is that done? Usually the central bank, the institution we call in America the Federal Reserve, creates the money and passes it first and foremost to big banks. Nowadays, it passes it also to big corporations beyond the banks. And those big institutions, among the richest in our country, then are supposed to take all of that extra money and, here we go, trickle it down so it percolates into and provides some sort of stimulus to the underlying economy. And what should come as no surprise to most of you is an awful lot of it never trickles very far down. Where does it go? Answer: into the stock market. The rich, the big banks, the insurance companies, those are the main players on the stock market. And as they get tons and tons of government money, and even as they get money from other sources, they have no incentive to plow it into the Main Street real economy, because with millions of people unemployed, they're not buying what they did before. There's no profit to be made in producing goods and services which your population cannot anymore afford because it's a crisis. So where does the money go? Into the stock market. There the hope is I can buy it today and sell that share 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years from now at a higher price and make money. The profit opportunities in the stock market are big, and the profit opportunities in doing pretty much everything else are very poor. So it should come as no surprise that the very poor quality of our lives, our jobs, and our prospects on the one hand, and the government pumping in money on the other, should end up with that money going to fuel an inflation of stock prices, which is a fun game for people who are in that business to buy and resell at a higher price, giving the stock market that peculiar quality of apparently booming when the rest of us are going in the opposite direction. Is it a crazy arrangement? Is it fiercely unfair? You bet. And that's because that's how capitalism works. If you don't want those injustices, if you don't want the people who are richest to be having a good time with public money while the rest of us are poor observers, then your problem is with capitalism, not with one or another of the details. This system works for the few at the top. It always has, and it's doing it now, despite a health crisis, despite an economic class, as much as it ever did. This is Richard Wolff for Democracy at Work.